Before we start, I would like to talk about how this podcast came about, which is twofold. The first inspiration is Roman Mars' podcast titled What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law, which started with the first Trump administration, which seems so long ago now. Second is my first time hearing my professor's lesson, where I thought to myself, he will make a great podcaster, and I'm happy to report that he is our first guest for this pilot episode of our podcast titled La Det Law, where we delve and deliberate into observations about Malaysia through a legal lens. In this pilot episode, we question the democracies of the United States and Malaysia to ask if Malaysia is now more democratic than the United States. Our audio editor is Joshua Ngu. Our guest and professor today is Prof. Andrew Harding, and I'm your host, Benjamin Ho. We do welcome any feedback and comments. Enjoy! Thank you, Professor Andrew Harding, for coming on to our show today. Professor Andrew Harding is a leading scholar in comparative constitutional law and legal studies. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Okay, so today's podcast inspiration comes from your semi-viral Facebook post that reads, "Announcement to all Malaysians, your country is now more democratic than the US. Your political leaders accept election results. You have 30 parties to vote for, not 2. Your elected leaders do not try to become king, as you already have 9 of those. You have a politically neutral apex court. Your institutions are not purged when there is a change of government. Migrants are not threatened with concentration camps." I see that you have been thoroughly challenged on that one. "The Prime Minister does not try to control artistic foundations, and you do not pardon violent criminals, only corrupt ones." I could go on, but you get my point, end quote. So, Professor, would you like to start off with a defense of this? Because most people in your comment section has not agreed with you as enthusiastically as you have pointed out here.
I think a lot of people have embraced it with enthusiasm and forwarded it and shared it, but some people have sort of kicked back. I mean, on the point of detention camps, there are issues, I think, in Malaysia. I'm not very familiar with this area, but I think probably it's pretty much a draw on that one rather than against Malaysia. We don't know quite what is going to happen in the US, but basically, they have said that they will set up concentration camps for undocumented migrants and even for some documented migrants, which is pretty horrifying. But okay, I'm sort of cherry picking, and maybe that was a bad cherry that I that I picked, and I'm offering this in a spirit of provocation with maybe a dash of impudence to see what the response is. The main, I think there are various ways one could push back. So in order to defend myself, I need to imagine, what are the objections to what I'm saying. One is that I leave out of account the rule of law, and maybe that's something we can come back to a bit later on in the discussion. But I would defend by saying that I didn't actually mention the rule of law in the post. What I pointed to was the impartiality of the apex court, and I think that virtually all commentators would say that the Supreme Court of the United States is not politically impartial anymore. Now that it has a 6-3 very conservative majority on the court. That was my point.
I think the United States Supreme Court always had a sort of political tagging to it, but I think we're seeing a very, very drastic, especially after Trump against the United States was published. I think most commentators will agree that the court has become more of a political institution rather than a very neutral one in trying to, spell the law out for everyone else.
Yeah, I mean that's really a huge point, and it's a big change because personally, I've always taken the appointments process for Supreme Court justice in the US rather unseriously because it's a very politicized process. But on the other hand, the actual outcomes in terms of Supreme Court decisions have not necessarily been that bad. But recently, they've taken a turn which is quite alarming. For example, in conferring immunity on the president for all official acts, which nobody anticipated that would be decided, is completely inconsistent with all the precedents. But on the Malaysian side, I think we have a very good bench. And I want to mention here, which nobody ever seems to mention, the federal court in Malaysia has a majority of women. Right. And I think this is a remarkable development. There is only one other country in the world that has a majority of women on its apex court, and it's not the United States, it's Canada.
That is very interesting. I did not know that.
Nobody knows. I keep mentioning it, and everybody's very surprised. Yeah. Why be surprised? It's all there on the website. You have 8 women and 6 men.
But yeah, I mean, though I think the Chief Justice this year is retiring. I meant the Chief Justice of Malaysia is retiring this year as she hits the age of 66 years and 6 months, which is the statutory retirement age. So on the point, actually, I want to press you a bit more on the judicial appointment side of things, because you've brought it up so wonderfully. I think what the Chief Justice actually mentioned in his speech in the opening of legal year this year, actually, only 2 points on the rule of law, the role of judges or rule of law, I'm not so sure, and judicial appointments, reminding, the executive of, the fact that judicial appointments should be kept out of politics. What do you make of the current judicial appointment process here in Malaysia? Because while it is true that we have a judicial Appointment Act, I'm not sure which year, but it remains firmly in the hands of the Prime Minister and executive to actually appoint the judges. Well, they have to go through the Agong, who has to accept this decision. What do you think of our current appointment process in Malaysia?
It's a very difficult question. How you should appoint judges. There was a big change with the Judicial Appointments Commission Act in 2009. And in my view, that act has had a positive impact on judicial appointments, because I think we see not just more women being appointed, which is a good thing, but also a greater variety in terms of ethnicity, religion, and also legal background, because the complaint was always that there are too many judges appointed from the public service and not enough from the bar. All of those things have improved over time. Now, the system is admittedly still not as good as it could be, because there's still the possibility of executive interference in the process. And I would personally like to see these reforms taken one step further, to say that the Judicial Appointments Commission decision should be binding on the executive. You may then get, of course, attempts to interfere with the membership of the Judicial Appointments Commission. But you see the point here. The struggle just sort of moves on from one issue to another. So I think it has improved. It's capable of more improvement. But again, to compare with the US, it is overtly politicized in the US. So I think that's coming from an entirely different perspective. And that does sort of play in the present situation, because we're faced with a rule of law crisis in America. There are now currently, I believe, 12 temporary restraining orders on the Trump administration, which have all been imposed within the last 3 weeks. And in no case has the administration been successful in resisting the claim for a TRO, as they put it. Obviously, the point here is to preserve a situation pending a full hearing and full argument. So it's not the end of the issue, but it shows that the courts are willing to impose these restraints on the administration. The real question is whether the administration will actually abide by the court orders. And the indication so far is that they might not. And then I think you're in a really serious constitutional crisis. And again, to compare with Malaysia, can we think of any example where the government has simply said, well, the courts can decide what they like, but guess what? We're going to do something different. I don't recall any such instance.
I think in that respect, I will have to agree with you, because I don't recall any prime minister or any parties, even like you said, like our country is more democratic on the basis that you said your political leaders accept election results, which is a wild thing to say because, in a democratic institution such as Malaysia, it is impossible for us to think of a situation where a leader can just say, "Nope, I've won," like the case in the United States. But I would like to challenge you, returning back to your announcement to all Malaysians that we are now more democratic than the United States, that we have 30 parties to vote for, not two. But referring to the two-party system, of course, in the United States, that you either have Donald Trump or Kamala Harris in the last election to choose from. No other candidates could have been taken seriously because of the first past the post system, which also exists here in Malaysia. But I think what you're referring to is the fact that we have a more diverse and more pluralistic coalition of parties. But I would like to push you on that because currently we have 3 coalitions that are very dominant in the field, and 2 of them are, I don't want to use the word in bed together, but they seem to be going along quite well, which is the Pakatan Harapan, which is the traditional opposition party or opposition coalition, and the Barisan Nasional, which is traditionally led by UMNO and ruled the country for 60 years or so. And we have another coalition now rising from the ashes of Mahathir's last party, in cahoots with I forgot the full name, but PAS, which are now firmly in control of actually a few seats that are quite surprising. Last I checked, I think even Putrajaya is under Perikatan Nasional, which is actually quite an urbanized area to be part of such a coalition. What do you make of the fact that actually right now Malaysians seem to think, because general consensus is that we don't really have a choice because Pakatan Harapan and UMNO are back together and they seem to be inseparable, and we have the traditional lineup of bad or worse again?
There's a very interesting way of posing this question. What we've seen in Malaysia since 2018 is a very fragmented political situation. So it's really the opposite of America, where you have 2 very powerful entrenched parties who basically have alternated power, deep into the 19th century, right? I mean, it's a long period of time. It does have, I think, the effect of depriving a lot of people of their democratic choice. I mean, there are so many Americans who did not want to vote for either Trump or Clinton, or did not want to vote for either Harris or Trump in the recent election, and we're looking at other candidates. But the point was that your vote would be completely wasted if you voted for Jill Stein, for example, or Ralph Nader in the past. I mean, those third candidates are just really kind of spoilers at the feast. RFK in the present instance. So a lot of people feel that their vote would not count. I mean, if you come from, say, Alabama, which has a 30% majority in favor of Trump, then you vote for a Democratic candidate. Your vote's not going to count for much. The same used to be true in Malaysia because you had a dominant party system. We could argue about when that came to an end. I mean, was it 2008 or 2018, or was it 1999 or whatever? But the point is that you don't have that dominant system, and I don't quite agree that the situation is concretized around 2 coalitions. They seem to me very fluid and not really that stable if we look at it over a period of time and how those coalitions formed. And some of those coalitions actually involve coalitions of other parties, like the East Malaysian coalitions, for example. So I think there is more pluralism. Whether Malaysia is best served by a first-past-the-post system or proportional representation would be an interesting question to discuss, maybe on another occasion. But the situation for now is that I think you do have more possibility as a Malaysian voter to influence who is going to be forming the government than you had before, and than you would have if you were voting in America. So I think that's a win for me. in terms of my post,
That,
I
that,
would say.
that brings into mind another criticism I've heard a lot from friends of mine or other peers, which is the fact that it seems to them that a lot of the parties' platform are very homogenized. They do not have very interesting or differing policies. Those that have faded into obscurities, like MUDA, for example. Parties that are on the fringe will usually have a lot more interesting policy ideas. But in terms of the as you said, like the major political parties, even though it seems to us that there is a plurality of parties out there, it seems like there is only a very homogenized idea out there of how to run the country. Fiscal conservatism seems to rule the day. Political ideology that remains stuck probably roughly in the 1970s and 1980s, revolving around national unity rather than a more celebration of more diverse ideas that are out there, which brings to mind that even in such a pluralistic system of different parties, it seems like their ideas are all rehashed versions of what they have said long ago in the past. What do you make of that?
Politics can be very disappointing in those terms. And I think most of the things you said also apply in America. It was startling to me the extent to which there was virtually no policy discussion during the US presidential campaign, or whatever discussion there was seemed to disappear in a sea of kind of emotion and arguments about culture wars and so on. So regrettably, although what you say is perfectly true about Malaysia, it's becoming very much true in most other places, it seems to me. What are political parties in Malaysia? Well, I think you're right. They don't really distinguish themselves on the basis of policies, except in some fairly sort of obvious areas like Chinese education or something. It's quite limited in those terms. But what they do tend to be is, vehicles for individuals. Personalities matter a lot. But what is the Republican Party in America if it isn't about Trump and his personality? And the fact that the opposition is also about Trump and what a bad personality he is. So it really is, even in America, it's all about personalities and culture wars, not really about policies. And that becomes a problem in terms of democracy, doesn't it, in both countries? Because when you cast your vote, what exactly are you voting for? Because, you can say, well, we have, the majority in the election gets to control the government, but are they compelled to fulfill what they have said they would do? In America, the answer seems to be no, they can do whatever they like, even though they may have said something completely opposite to that during the campaign. So party politics is a huge problem everywhere. And a big question, how do you get them to focus more on policy and sensible answers to difficult questions? That's a problem.
Yeah. I mean, okay, politics is disappointing. It's a true statement almost everywhere, I guess. So I guess we have a draw there. But moving on to it, you talked about, the fact that we have 9 kings in Malaysia, and the fact that we have a politically neutral apex court. I'd like to move into the idea of the fact that institutional strength somehow relates to democracy. Because in most people's mind, when they hear the word democracy, most people don't bring to mind, oh, how strong is the SPR doing? How strong is the institution of the state going to guarantee the results of my elections? Because these are very abstract to most people, actually. While it's very practical to us, most people would find it very out there, behind the scenes. Do you think we should widen the idea of democracy to bring in, the 20th century idea of what a liberal democracy should mean? Strong institutions, respect for the rule of law, these ideas, or should it be more of a understanding towards popular rule? Because I think when we talk about democracy in Malaysia, it seems to always revolve around the fact of elections, elections, elections. Not a lot of people bring into mind, how strong our institutions are, how independent truly is, for example, the SPR or the police or any other institutions.
I absolutely think that democracy is not just about who wins the national election. And even if it were about that, you would have to consider questions like, are elections properly run by the Election Commission? Is the Election Commission independent? Are elections free and fair? Do people have the opportunity of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association in the conduct of those elections? So even if we just confined it only to elections, we'd still be talking about the institutional arrangements and how reliable those things are. It becomes a problem when people think that the outcome of an election decides absolutely everything. And that's what's happening now in America, which I claim has never and would never happen in Malaysia, is that the idea is that if you win an election, you get to change absolutely everything. You can dismiss people from the civil service. You can deconstruct entire departments of government. You can impose your will on the prosecutors, and now 6 of those have resigned apparently, and they see it as a kind of a spoil system, that if you win the election, then you win absolutely everything, and nobody has a right to push back because you won the election. We had that in Britain with the Brexit referendum, where anybody who criticized what happened after that was accused of being a traitor because you were exercising your freedom of speech to criticize what was happening or to say what should happen after the vote. So this is a false idea of democracy. And yes, people don't realize that the institutional supports are absolutely critical. But if you don't have that realization at some level, you don't have those supports, you just have an elective dictatorship. And we know that when you have that, it's not that the people can then remove that government in the next election, because there may not be a next election. That's our experience, because they will remove the guardrails. And that's what Trump and co are trying to do, and so far, very successfully. None of the things that have happened in the last 3 weeks can you imagine happening in Malaysia. That is my fundamental point.
That's an interesting point to bring about, because I think, yes, you brought up the fact that what's happening in the United States right now is wild and insane, because there's absolutely no respect for any sort of, institutional strength of the system, the civil service being apolitical, the judges and the judiciary being actually independent part.
Can I just interject one point here? That in Malaysia, public servants are protected under the Constitution. There has to be a case brought against them on actual grounds for dismissal before they can be dismissed. And in theory, that should be the same more or less in America. But in fact, whole swathes of civil service have simply been dismissed without any process.
Yes, I've seen countless complaints online about, the Department of Government Efficiency run by Trump's best buddy now, Elon Musk, ruining entire departments. And apparently CNN just reported the other day that apparently they fired people who were responsible for controlling nuclear weapons and did not realize their mistake and tried to quickly reverse that result, which is an absolute...
shows you how dangerous this is. I mean, the equivalent in Malaysia, imagine this, would be that Tony Fernandez or Jeffrey Chia marches into a government department with a whole troop of young hackers and says, right, I'm taking over your computer systems, and by the way, you're all sacked. I mean, this is just totally unimaginable in Malaysia that this could possibly happen, even with the most powerful business people, the barons of industry and so on. Even with those people, there's no way that could happen.
That is an interesting thought to give in. But I mean, Malaysia has been marked by scandals in the past in terms of, who judicial appointments, in terms of who gets to go into political office, but never as brazen as what is happening right now in
No,
the...
I mean, we're told by the U.S. Department of Justice that the 1MDB scandal is the biggest case of kleptocracy in human history. Well, okay, that may be so, but look at what is happening with Musk. I mean, he contributed millions to Trump's election campaign. He then benefited in billions in terms of share prices immediately after the election because of his closeness with the president, and is now being rewarded with government handouts when he himself is demolishing whole departments of government on which people depend, like USAID, for example. And he is getting billions of handouts from the US federal government. And if that isn't a corruption scandal, even in a way worse than 1MDB, I would like to know what is.
Yes, you're absolutely correct there. Then I would like to challenge you more on another side of what we think of when it comes to democracy, which is fundamental rights and liberties associated with a liberal democracy, namely the freedom of speech, freedom of expression. These are not rights traditionally associated with Malaysia. We are more associated with the Sedition Act, SOSMA, and other forms of governmental control over access to information. What do you make of this fact right now in the United States that there still exists a pretty robust First Amendment rights in terms of the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press that may not be the same here in Malaysia?
Well, this is a very interesting comparison, and let me make one or two observations here. What you said about the United States traditionally has been true, but I frankly doubt whether it is true, these days. I mean, just for example, major newspapers were threatened with lawsuits by the president, and they all settled out of court for large figures. During the election campaign, the Washington Post refused to endorse either candidate in the election. And guess what? The man who owns the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, is now figured very close to Trump in the inauguration ceremony because he did not want the president to be upset. Now, does that indicate a free press in America? I think those freedoms that you mentioned are seriously on the decline now in America. What you say historically about Malaysia is probably right, but what you can see is a different trajectory here. The Prime Minister has said that there will be a law allowing protests merely to notify the police of their intention rather than seeking permission from the police. Contrast in America, Trump has said he will turn the military on what he calls lunatic leftist protesters if he deems it necessary. So we're faced with a situation where things appear to be gradually improving in Malaysia, whereas they're rapidly going downhill in America. And let's remember that the Internal Security Act and all the emergency proclamations were ended in 2011. Yes, there is SOSMA, but many countries have laws similar to SOSMA rather than the Internal Security Act. So, things have somewhat improved. There are still areas where there is no real freedom of speech in this country, but in America also there are things that cannot be said. People, professors will be turned out of their university positions if they say certain things. So freedom of speech is very much under threat there.
That's a very interesting and stark observation of the decline of these freedoms in the United States. But what you have noted in Malaysia is still much rather a trajectory that you have said, because trajectories are in Malaysia are fickle as rainwater sometimes, because in 2018 we were promised a new government, and as soon as that came, it went away. And and recently, when we were promised a swath of new laws, I think, especially, I would like to draw attention to the Freedom of Information Act, which aims to also amend the Official Secrets Act, which right now prohibits a lot of information, even parliamentary business, from being published on to the public for review. And I think freedom of information is one of those things that work in the background, but is absolutely vital in terms of journalism work. In America, journalists file FOIA requests all the time to gain access to information that otherwise would never see the light of day, to hold government accountable to different actions. What do you make of the fact that, in 2023, Malaysia, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, said that on principle they would agree to pass the act of the Freedom of Information Act, and said that it would be tabled soon. Last year they said it would be tabled the end of last year, and by the end of last year they said it would be tabled this year, which represents sort of like the experience of some Malaysians towards, hopeful changes and transitions, where they get promised one thing and gets pushed back. They get promised another and gets more pushback on that. And it seems to be that last mile that will never be reached.
Yeah, this has been the story in Malaysia on many issues over many years. And I think we all know about politicians and activists who've been struggling with these issues for maybe 30, 40, 50 years, and they might still say there hasn't been that much progress. And you've given a very good example of this. Suffice it to say that at the moment it is the official government policy, it seems from pronouncements by the Minister for Law, that there will be freedom of information. In what form and how far that will go and when it will happen, those are other issues. But I think it's a reminder that we have to keep struggling with these issues, and nothing changes unless you just keep hammering away. And many times it will be unsuccessful and promises will be unfulfilled. But if you look at what's happened over a period of time, there has been a distinct liberalization. It still could go an awful lot further. But compare with the situation in America, where, from slavery to the Civil Rights Act took more than 100 years of all sorts of legislation, activism, all kinds of things happened during, pushback from the southern states. It's, in a way, I think a lot of people in America would say that struggle is still going on even now as we speak, 60 years after the Civil Rights Act. So these issues never go away. The struggle never goes away. And if you don't struggle, it's amazing how negative change can happen so incredibly quickly. It's just been about less than 4 weeks in America. Everything has changed. And, there was an interesting article about how Hitler dismantled German democracy in 53 hours and 10 and a half minutes or something. 53 days, 19 hours and 10 minutes or something it took to dismantle the whole system. And I want to make an interesting point here, which I didn't mention in the post, but I think it's quite important, which is federalism. And it's something that people tend to neglect in the discussion of these issues around democracy and institutions and the rule of law and so on. Because it's very interesting now that in America you have blue states that are pushing back on what the federal administration is doing. And this is a real resource. The first thing Hitler did when he came into power was to abolish federalism. And he was actually right. If you want to establish absolute power, the first thing you do is, obliterate those potential sources of dissent. And I do wonder, how does that play in the Malaysian situation? Because you now have a changing situation where state governments can be controlled by any party or any combination of parties, whereas before it was always the BN and that was it. They just controlled,
except for Penang,
and they and except for Sabah or whatever. But they basically controlled everything for a long period of time. So I think an important question would be, how can federalism be used to counter federal power in America? And would the same sort of thing happen if you had such an ambitious populist government in Malaysia? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting point because I'm from Sarawak, and the Sarawakian government would like to constantly remind every single Sarawakian all the time that they counter federal power all the time in terms of tax revenue, in terms of the petroleum industry, and trying to claim back the supposed neo-colonial power of Malaya, which has exercised their rights over certain tax revenues.
Right.
And I think in terms of that, what do you make of the fact that for example, right now in Malaysia, the Sarawak government is leveraging their position as a core member of the coalition in the government to gain concession from the federal government, when most Malaysians, in fact, would not even think of that when they are trying to vote for whatever party they are, except for maybe in Sarawak.
Well, this is another example of of progress in the constitutional system in Malaysia. I think it's yet really to be fulfilled. But obviously, any government that really refuses to respond to the desire for more autonomy in East Malaysia is looking at electoral trouble. And they're going to lose a lot of support. And as we know, the Sabah Sarawak parties generally these days hold the balance of power between the two sides. So this is kind of already a welcome form of ventilation in the system. And that may well, in fact, I'd predict that it would improve over time, because the demand for autonomy seems to be an absolute given with, I think, would you agree, all East Malaysians believe they should have more autonomy. And that's a very, very powerful constituency. It hasn't yet quite happened, but I think it's going to happen.
As an East Malaysian, yes, of course, I do agree for more autonomy.
I thought you might.
The state of Sabah and Sarawak has been struggling for years in terms of, how much budget we've been granted and how much output our state has actually poured into the federal government. And there's a perceived imbalance of how the federal government seems to be favoring West Malaysian states in terms of really extreme needs, such as infrastructure. That the Pan-Borneo Highway actually was just constructed roughly 10 or so years ago only. And I think that brings into mind a very, very fundamental aspect of democracy, which is pluralism. Who do we listen to when we're making very difficult decisions that affect multiple parties? Because when we talk about budgeting, when we talk about infrastructure, we're choosing between different populations. Who do we choose to advance first? Who do we choose to listen first? Is a very interesting thing in a democracy. So would you agree in saying that federalism improves democracy, or would you say the other way around? Because in terms of sheer numbers, especially, West Malaysia actually holds overwhelming majority in that regard.
I think both things are true. I think federalism improves democracy because you have democracy at more levels. That's very important. But democracy also improves federalism, more accountability. Even state governments and local governments need to be accountable, not just the central government. I'm not arguing here that Malaysia is in a better position than the United States, because I see, in terms of the blowback against advancing authoritarianism in America, that the states will be extremely important. And I think that will be a test of this advancing authoritarianism. Can the federal government assert power over the states? And I think the answer to that may well be no, it can't. Right. But the situation in Malaysia is, as you say, it's a shifting pattern, and it involves many different, political and policy elements, as well as issues of identity and religion and so on. So it's a complex picture, but I see federalism becoming more and more meaningful over time. I think that is a happening event.
I would like to bring you back to a previous point that you made just now on the fact that federal power might not be able to push back on these blue states in America because if I get my history right, the Constitution actually arises out of the fact that there is a general dissatisfaction of the lack of a very strong central government. That's why the Constitution of the United States actually came about in the Philadelphia Convention, which agreed in principle that the individual states are doing too many different things, and the Continental Congress has too little powers and doesn't even have its own budget at the time, subject to all the states' approval. Do you think this represents a regression in terms of the vision of the founding fathers of America? Because I feel like in terms of democracy, we want to not only uphold the will of the people, but as we have discussed just now briefly on the institutions of the states, and especially in the United States, created by the Constitution. Would you think that it is a regression from this vision that they have tried, that the founding fathers of America tried to do, in the 1700s?
It is absolutely a regression, and not just on that issue, but I think on many issues, there is an attempt in America to sort of rewrite history as saying that in America the whole idea is a republic, not a constitutional democracy, and the people just get to vote for the president, and then the president has this kind of overweening power. This is not consistent with the history or the original vision in any shape or form, but that's what people are trying to now present to justify this kind of advancing authoritarianism. But federalism, I think, runs very ancient and very deep in America, and to some extent, it is proving that is the case in Malaysia as well. And I think it is unlikely in my mind that the federal government will be able to significantly assert power over the states. The ultimate test would be, would the president send in federal troops to enforce a decision of his own that is resisted by a state government? I think that is, even for Trump, I think that is a bridge too far, and that's simply not going to be possible in the American system.
Well, with Trump, I think we have to be a bit more careful with our words. I mean, his limits are beyond our imagination. Who knows what he will do tomorrow?
We don't know, and we don't know how people are going to be able to resist this. But it seems that the US is heading towards a big constitutional crisis. Malaysia too has had its constitutional crises. I mean, many constitutional crises. But I think it has reached a level of stasis in terms of, acceptance of the Constitution as the guiding principle, acceptance of elections, the results of elections. Although one might say here that, the whole issue with the Sheraton move in 2020 was an example of not accepting the result of an election. But this is sort of marginal in terms of what's happened in America. So that's how I see it.
Well, now I'd like to turn back to the fact that to the proclamation that you wrote so beautifully, that the Malaysia is now more democratic than the United States. I think one key element of democracy when we talk about is civic participation, in terms of how vocal people can be, in terms of not just at the federal level what the decision-making process is in parliament, but also on a local level. But in Malaysia, I don't think we see that level of involvement among general public in terms of public works. Do you think that affect Malaysia's democratic zeitgeist? Because in my opinion, I see that in Malaysia, most people only associate democracy with the federal election, and even with regards to state election, they're not so sure in terms of what powers the state has, because they view the state parliament as being inferior to the federal parliament, when in fact, I think the more appropriate way of looking at it is in terms of different powers that they each hold in different regards, for example, that is listed and enumerated in the federal constitution. Do you think that in Malaysia, this lack of civic participation and understanding towards the legal and constitutional framework of our country will lead to, does this in any way affect the democratic nature of our country? Because most people don't think of democracy as this all-encompassing activity, merely as an act done every 5 years.
I think you're absolutely right about that. Now, I don't know if you intended this as a cue, but can I talk about my recent book in this connection? Because it's called Territorial Governance in Southeast Asia, published by Hart Bloomsbury last month. And this is an issue that I very much take up in the book. And I totally agree with what you say on this. I mean, it's an indispensable foundation to have a vibrant civil society. You can't have democracy if you don't have a civil society, really. I mean, okay, there's no such thing as perfect democracy or total non-existence of democracy, but you're much more likely to have a good democracy, a stable democracy, if you have a vibrant civil society, not just political parties, but issue-related civil society organizations, and a general sort of culture of public participation. I totally believe that, which is why I've talked about localism and subsidiarity in the book, and specifically addressed the fact that there are no local government elections in Malaysia, which I think is a big problem. And I want to note here that all the other 4 countries I look at have local government elections. Only Malaysia does not have local government elections in the whole of Southeast Asia, which is pretty astonishing, right? But of course, people may say, yeah, but at least you can vote for the state government, but the state is still pretty remote from the locality. So I totally agree with that. There has to be, and maybe this is relevant to the comparison that we're talking about, that there is a strong culture of democracy at every level in America, and hopefully that is something that will help people to push back on this authoritarian trend that we're seeing. I mean, it's still early days, and even court cases are not particularly developed at this point, and the political process is sort of stunned and hasn't yet kind of recovered from what's happened the last few weeks. So let's see. Malaysia has yet to develop that kind of depth of democratic culture, which we should find in every workplace, never mind every local government, state government, federal government. And so civil society, I mean, let's say, I'm not sure that it's right to say that Malaysia doesn't have a developed civil society. I think it does. It may not be as developed as some other countries, but regionally, I think people actually look to Malaysia as a place, where there are a lot of civil society organizations. I mean, Penang particularly seems to have been a kind of an epicenter of civil society organization for the whole region, not just for Malaysia. So things are not too bad in that area, it seems to me.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So when we talk about civil societies and the lack of government election, my first impression of America in terms of their democracy actually didn't stem from presidential elections or anything. I actually watched a show called Parks and Recreation, wonderful show about local government, filled with amazing humor. A lot of people watch it, and I feel like that's my first exposure to what democracy is, where you see local officials trying their best to ensure small changes, but having big effect on local people, because what's happening in Putrajaya today may not affect me now or 5 years, maybe 10 years down the line, I might see some sort of an effect on the general direction of the country. But immediately, what I can see if I have the power to vote locally is that I developed that sort of mindset that I am able to participate in decision making across all levels, not just in terms of the very big ones in parliament, but also in terms of whether we keep this park or not, whether we invest more in sewage. These are very real life issues that most people will not think that they have a vote or a voice in Malaysia, that I think is absolutely necessary. And in the United States, I think there is a very strong culture of local elections, of ensuring that, different positions, like such as not just, local elections, but even sometimes the attorney general would be elected, which is a wild idea to me, but seems to be the norm in America.
Yeah, sometimes democracy can go too far. Yeah, so electing judges and attorneys general, it becomes a bit absurd. But I totally appreciate your comments on this. And in fact, in the book, I have very much stressed the fact that local government, not even state government, local government deals with so many issues that impact directly on people's lives in a way that federal government never seems to. You talk about housing, transport, garbage collection, sewage, irrigation. There are so many issues. And in some countries these days, even health, education, and social care are essentially local functions, not so much in Malaysia, but still, the whole planning system and development, business licenses, all of these things are local authority powers, but most people don't seem to realize that. They only realize local government exists when something goes wrong, and then they complain. But they don't take the complaint in terms of, well, we should be allowed to elect these people out of government. They just make it a complaint that somebody should do something to make sure the garbage is better collected or whatever it is. But if you don't have local democracy, then, how are you going to get your councillors to do the right thing? Because they're not answerable to you, the voter. They're answerable to the state government. That's the body that appoints them. And it becomes, to a ridiculous extent, if you look at Kuala Lumpur, for example, one of the most important cities in the whole region,
absolutely,
a rapidly expanding mega city, they have no democracy at all. They don't even have a state government to lobby with regard to local issues.
Because it's federal.
Their mayor is appointed by the federal government. This is astonishing. I don't know of any other country where the capital city's mayor is appointed by the national government. This is quite extraordinary. And so I told people in KL, you are the most underrepresented citizens in the whole of Asia.
Oh, indeed, that is very, very true. Because when we look into local government, most people think of mayors as people appointed from on high, when in fact across whole swaths of democracy, mayors are actually one of the most contested elections. If you look into London, there are like 15 people running for the mayor position, and sometimes satirized, of course. You see Count Binface on there. I don't know if you know about this very funny election zeitgeist there in the UK to make fun of elections. But I feel like...
But we still finished up with Boris Johnson, so
somehow,
it wasn't that great. But it's an interesting point that, right across the region, so many national presidents are former mayors of big cities. So in the other countries, stretching right up to, Korea and Japan and so on, you get a strong element of local democracy. And I think so that is a stage forward. And in terms of the comparison, the US wins hands down when it comes to subnational democracy. Definitely, I would agree that.
So I would like to bring into another point, which is democracy and its conflict with the rule of law, because there seems to be exceptions sometimes out there. I'd like to bring in, the country of El Salvador, which has a extremely popular president, or prime minister, I think it's President Nayib Bukele, which implemented a drastic campaign to jail every single member of the supposed gangs out there with no due process at all. They have group trials where people have complained, where family members of people who have been accused saying that there are trials held en masse where 250 people are on trial, and if you can't prove the innocence of 250 people, you are going straight to jail. And there are families who decry this. But when you look at the populace as a whole, you see that there are so many people out there supporting this president who is outright just dismantling the state institution. Where in America, yes, while we do see certain support, but we also see a lot of pushback online in terms of how Trump is, dismantling the state institutions, how they are, disobeying Congress in terms of, the dismantling of USAID. What do you make of the fact that there could be one day in Malaysia something like a Nayib Bukele figure that aims to overhaul government by completely dismantling it? And would that fit into a democratic ideal? Because most El Salvadorian would say that their country is democratic, but most commentators would say yes, but there is human rights issue and this and that. But when you talk about democracy, you bring in institutions. Does that example affect your assessment in any way?
Well, I think the example is a distressing but great example. And we've had instances in the past also with Duterte in the Philippines, with Suharto in Indonesia, flagrant breaches of rights and the rule of law in terms of trying to achieve a particular result, such as, suppressing the drug trade or whatever it is. Populism, I think we can sort of see this as something where people become impatient and they want instant results to respond to real problems. I mean, we shouldn't minimize that.
Definitely.
And if the state, with all its kind of procedures and democratic principles and so on, fails to solve these problems, then you are open to populism. And populism rapidly becomes a form of tyranny. That's what we see. And this is where the institutions come in, because, as we said earlier, if the electoral majority means you can change anything you like, then you can simply dismantle the whole of your democratic institutions. So ultimately, in democratic terms, populism becomes self-defeating because it actually overturns democracy, because, as we said, democracy is more than simply elections. It's about institutions. But we have to make our institutions effective in solving real problems. It's no good having, the rule of law in the Constitution if your economy declines and your social fabric disintegrates and crime is rampant and all the rest of it. We have to be able to solve those things. But we have to be able to do it in a way that is consistent, that is done under law, not outside the law, and is still done consistently with basic human rights. It's not an easy thing to pull off, but the danger is that you'll be where El Salvador is now if you don't.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful. I would completely agree with you on that. So if you don't have any more points to defend on your statement, I think we'll end it here. It's been wonderful having you, Professor Andrew Harding. I thoroughly enjoy your lecture, and I'm thoroughly excited having you on this podcast. Hope to see you more often.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great. Thanks, Benjamin.